but just the very fact of being overwhelmed is not sinful. And what's amazing is that Jesus, even through those emotions, served, and he never sinned. And the positive of that for me then too is that he's my substitute and he's your substitute. So that when you sin when you're overwhelmed, when you lose control and you do something that's wrong, when you harm a relationship, when you give in to that addiction, Jesus is your substitute too. He knows that temptation, he has overcome it. And he says to you, I'm going to give you my record. You're forgiven for that too.
I'm on my way to glory.
Yeah, I've just got some questions that I think will kind of help introduce you to folks and give me an opportunity to pull little clips out to advertise for the retreat. And I want to talk mostly, I think the sort of the thrust of the meeting or of the interview will be about being diagnosed with depression and this tension between sharing that with people and not sharing it with people, looking at maybe some of the parallels between depression and substance use. And then I really like how your articles often end with sort of a ringingly clear gospel message to people who are suffering. And so hopefully we'll get to some of that as well.
Cool.
All right.
I did nothing to prep for this since I didn't know what to expect. So
okay, good. Well, yeah, hopefully
this doesn't devolve into a whose line is in any way skit.
Yeah, we'll try and avoid that. So, yeah, let's start out with just learning a little bit more about you and maybe telling us a little bit about little Luke Italiano. Where'd you grow up? What kind of community was it? Just a little bit about yourself.
I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota. My dad was a music teacher there. My mom had a lot of jobs. She worked factories a lot and still is actually. Fargo, North Dakota is the big city. Literally half the population in North Dakota belongs to that city. So I was very much a city slicker. And always just heavily involved in the arts. Especially in high school, there was a summer theater camp that took up all summer that I was always heavily involved in. Did just about everything you could do there, singing, dancing, not as much on that. I did a lot of orchestra, tech work, did some directing, helped actually teach video production after a few years because I got that good at it. Mm-hmm. Just a lot of art stuff. I attended a WELS high school for 2 years, and that particular high school at that point in time was not a good match in a number of ways. And I ended up graduating from public high school. And so I'm kind of a weird pastor when it comes to the WELS, that I can look at WELS schools and go, hey, I know what it's like to go there. And I can look at the public schools and go, I know what that's like too. Uh-huh. Yeah.
For folks who might see this and might not know the acronym WELS, I'm going to task you with the nearly impossible task of explaining what the WELS is.
The WELS is the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod.
Rolls off the tongue.
Yes, it is a mouthful. That's actually squished together. Originally, the name was something like the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and other states. And then it got squished together into something even smaller, which is still a mouthful. It is a Christian denomination that basically says, hey, what the Bible says is what it means. And then we subscribe also to something called the Lutheran Confessions, which basically says, hey, this is what we say the Bible means. So you can go there if you're a little confused. And that's what unites us, is what we say, what the Bible says.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very cool. Thank you. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your path to the pastorate then.
It was rocky.
Uh-huh.
So in high school, I dated a young woman who was not in my church. And we were serious enough for that. For a long time, we attended both of our churches every single Sunday. We went to hers at 8. We went to mine at 10:30. And I loved her church. I love the music. It was music that actually seemed to praise God as opposed to being long and draggy. The pastor gave 40-minute sermons and he spoke clearly and effectively. And then we would go to my church and I was bored out of my mind. But I knew that my church taught things that I'd agreed with that her church didn't. For instance, her church said that communion was just a picture, and I disagree with that. I say that communion really is Jesus' body and blood. He says what he means. And I was really pulled, and I said, you know what? I'm going to fix my church body. I'm going to fix the WELS. And I went to college for the
no grandiosity there.
Yes, none at all. I went to college for the first year to be a pastor, and no one listened to this genius 18-year-old who knew how to fix everything. It was shocking to me.
Yeah.
I ended up quitting after that first year. At that time, I told my parents, yeah, it's just a 1 year off. I need to take some time. Really, the intent was I'm never going back. I was just so angry. And God took that year to really humble me. A lot of stuff happened that year that I ended up going back to train for the ministry with a very different intent. And that intent was, I just want to serve. If that's as a pastor, cool. If they say, no, this isn't for you, that's cool. And I haven't been kicked out yet. So apparently this is where I get to serve for now.
Although it's just looming over your head at any moment, it could just be pulled away from you. Also, as I was reading your blog entries and so on, I understand that you are a self-described geek, perhaps a bit of a fanboy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
One of the things I inherited from my dad, he took me to the comic shop every week before I can remember. He collected up until the point he went blind. My dad went blind about 5-6 years back. And so I don't think they have comics in Braille. I could be wrong on that, but yeah. He stopped at that point. I still go to the comic shop every week. I was there yesterday. I love comics. I love Star Trek. I love Star Wars. That's just me in a nutshell as far as the kind of pop culture I get into.
Mm-hmm. And you see some parallels between the stories and the metaphors in science fiction and Christianity, or
there is. We would call it a big fancy term, the natural knowledge of God. Mm-hmm. There's a natural knowledge in everyone that there's something out there and good and evil matter. And you can pick up those themes, whether you're Christian or not, in a lot of the best stories. And so, yeah, you can see these little shadows of, hey, look, someone gets it here. One of my favorites is the movie The Dark Knight with Christian Bale. Did you know that movie is about Jesus?
I thought it was about Batman.
Yeah, you would think so.
Yeah.
Now I am pretty sure that the people who wrote it had no clue what they were doing. But at the end of that movie, Batman is really good friends with a guy by the name of Harvey Dent. And at the end of the movie, Harvey Dent is driven insane by the villain, by the Joker, and he ends up killing some people. And Batman says, no one can know what happened to this guy. No one can know that Harvey went bad. So I'm going to take the blame. Let the police chase me so that Harvey Dent has a clear record. And I see a little shadow of Jesus there.
Yeah.
That Jesus took the crime away from me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about depression. I think you created a series of blogs talking about your depression and being pretty open and honest and vulnerable about that. So let's just talk about the depression itself. When did you first notice that you were having symptoms of depression?
So depression is a lot like a lot of other mental illness or neurodivergence, that you will be diagnosed at a certain point. But if you look backwards, you see shadows of it all over in your life. So I was first diagnosed 7-8 years ago, 2014, so 8 years ago now. And the reason I was diagnosed is that I was having a real hard time. And there was one day where I could not get myself out of bed. I had things to do. I knew I had to do them. And I could not force myself out of bed. And I knew that this isn't right. There's something wrong with me. And so I went to my doctor. They did a blood test, found out that I had basically no vitamin D in my system. Vitamin D is one of those things that really helps your brain function well, and in particular will help you be able to feel good. And the doctor said, "Well, I'm going to give you this questionnaire." And I took this questionnaire, and he said, "Oh, yeah, yeah. This looks like you've got depression. We're going to send you to a specialist to get the diagnosis. And in fact, you may even be bipolar." And that scared the crap out of me.
Yeah, I bet. What was that like? What was that moment like when he said that, or what were the thoughts going through your head when you heard those words, depression and bipolar?
My first thought was telling my congregation I had to resign.
Hmm.
At that point, I was convinced there was no way that I could be a pastor with these diagnoses. In particular, bipolar. I've served a number of people with bipolar disorder, and I know how overwhelming that can be. And I was in a congregation where there was a lot of funerals. It was an older congregation, and I was deathly scared of, if I was manic, if I was happy and excited during a funeral. Well, like, how do you minister to someone like that? It's not that I lost my faith in Jesus. It's that I could not fathom how you could serve as a pastor with those diagnoses. So really scared, terrified. Part of it was a little bit of a relief, because I finally had a name for these things that were bothering me, that had dogged me for years. And when I went in for the diagnosis, I was diagnosed only with depression, not with bipolar disorder, for which I'm thankful, although it would not shock me if I was still borderline. I can tell I will have certain days where I get all the things done. That happened actually Monday, so 2 days before we're recording this. I had a day where I was getting all the things done. It was great. I checked off everything on my list for ministry. I got some checklists off on my hobbies. I spent time with all my kids. And then the next day I was like, nope, don't care. And it wasn't even down. It wasn't dark. It was just, no, I don't have any energy. I'm just not going to do anything now, which is one of those symptoms that can be bipolar.
Yeah, it's almost like a hangover in a way too. You kind of used up all your energy, and then I guess the body's searching for homeostasis, so it brings you down after that to maybe try and bring you to a level point.
Yep.
So when you say you look back over your life and you could see kind of signs of it, what was depression like for you? How did you experience what depression was?
So I was often moody, especially once I hit middle school. And I think a lot of people, myself included, just chalk that up to, hey, I'm a teenager. That's what happens. Once I got to public high in particular, once I was 16, 17 years old, I started getting really high highs and really low lows. I mean, I remember being with a whole bunch of friends, just hanging out and being really hyper and literally running, planting my hands on people's shoulders and flipping over them, which I really can't do now. But just having that, and then I didn't chart it then. These days I keep record of when I have these days. But and then having days where I'm just, no, I don't want to do anything. No. For me, it hit really hard. As I think often happens, a relationship sort of triggered a lot of things. I dated that girl for a long time, and right after high school, she broke up with me, and a month later moved in with a new boyfriend, and that killed me. And I actually started cutting at that point. Now that probably should have been a sign that, I needed help. But it was something I kept secret. I was scared. I didn't tell anyone. And that cutting, I'm very thankful. I don't remember ever being suicidal. I don't remember ever saying, I want to end my life. If my life happened to end, I would not have fought. But I didn't want to kill myself. But what happened was that I was so messed up that having that focus of physical pain seemed to relieve the mental and emotional pain. And it was not good. Um, that is not a healthy way to take care of that depression. It did not help. And I was looking for relief, and there was no relief there. I'm very thankful that over about a year that went away, and it was never serious. I never had to be hospitalized for it. I mean, it was serious that it was happening, but I never caused permanent damage to myself the way some of my friends did who did the same thing. So I can look back and I can look at that time in particular and say, yeah, I should have gotten help then. And that would have helped immensely. When I was in college, I remember at that point in time, the college I went to, Martin Luther College, if you were starting to become a pastor, they took, and I have no clue if this is still the way it is, but at that point in time, they took attendance very seriously, that if you missed a day, that was not a good thing. If you missed 2 days, and if you missed a certain number of days, no, you were not allowed in the program anymore. And they were very, very strict on it. And every semester, I would call it now taking a mental health day. Back then, I just said, I'm going to give myself 1 day semester where I'm going to be okay if I don't show up. And I realize now that was me giving myself that mental health day. But I can see that now. Back then it was, I just need a day that I just can't do this. I need a day off. And so I would take that.
Yeah, interesting. So you didn't even really have a name for it, but still experiencing these things. Yeah, it's interesting too as you talk about that. I think some of the parallels to substance use too are people get signals that something is up with their substance use, and at a certain point they may even there's no denying it, but it's just interesting when people actually do ask for help and when they truly avail themselves of it. And it's a mystery at this point that I can't predict or figure out. But I know for myself and many other people, there's a period of time where you're in this thing and you know it's what's going on is not healthy, and yet the point at which it stops hasn't happened yet. Or the point at which you seek help in earnest hasn't happened yet. And it can seem maybe a bit perplexing to people on the outside as to why that would happen.
I can tell you in high school, it was a fear because there was a mental hospital in Fargo where I grew up, and everyone knew you didn't want to go there. I had enough friends that went there and came back with horror stories. And I don't know if that was horror stories because when you're being treated, that's not necessarily a pleasant thing, or if it was a bad place, I couldn't tell you. But I did not want to go there. And once I was out as a pastor, I didn't want to risk what's going to happen to me if people find out I have this. And that's scary. It is a risk. Yeah.
There's I think the image of an asylum or a mental hospital in our collective imagination has all these resonances of horror films and of mistreatment and of experimentation on people, and it brings up a lot of baggage along with it. And then on top of that, you've got just the stigma of mental illness and what would it look like to get help. So what's a day in the life of a pastor who's dealing with depression? What is that like?
I'm sorry, but that's a really hard question to answer because
it probably depends on the day.
Yeah. Like I said, even this week, Monday, I was near manic. I was getting stuff done. Brain was firing on all cylinders. I was fine talking to people. I am blessed to be in a congregation where I can text nearly anyone in the congregation, which for me means I can get a hold of anyone and just, hey, how are you doing? And touch base really easily and really quickly. And it's not an hour-long conversation, or maybe it is, but I can text a whole bunch of people at the same time. And for me, that works really well. I communicate far better that way just for my mental health. And so I was firing on all cylinders, getting all this stuff done. And then Tuesday came. I had certain things that I had to do that I just said, no, I'm just not going to do them. And it wasn't even a sadness. It wasn't like I was saying, oh, woe is me. It was just, I don't care anymore.
Motivation is gone.
Motivation is gone.
Drive is gone. Maybe not the weight of sadness and depression, or even some of the unnecessary guilty feelings, but just the motivation and the drive is not there.
Yep. And so I spent most of the day just hanging out, not doing a whole lot. I did some things, and the things that I actually had to do, I was able to do. One of the things I've learned in my ministry is that because those days come, I work way ahead. I know many pastors will write their sermons on Saturday to preach on Sunday. Right now, I have rough drafts done for my sermons through August 14th. I'm a month and a half ahead for sermons. I have done worship planning through the end of November. So I know what the sermons are going to be about even. I've not done work past that. But I work way ahead so that if those things come, or when those days come, I can afford it. And one of the blessings of being a little bit more open with my depression is that if I've got a meeting with someone and I know, you know what, if I'm coming in with this lack of motivation, or if I'm feeling down and that's not going to serve you, I can contact that person, usually by text, and say, you know what, today is just not a good day. Can we try again tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some people that I'll look and I'll say, I know, if I don't meet with you today, I'm not going to see you for the next 2-3 months. And because I have this outlet for many of my meetings, I can then go to that person and say, I'm going to meet with you, and I can push through, and it'll be okay. But then the rest of the day, I know I'll be able to recover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting. There's almost like your mood is doing this, and your prefrontal cortex is managing it. And a psychiatrist friend of mine said that no matter what the disorder, if you're intelligent, it's a bonus. That you learn how to manage it. You learn how to think in advance. You learn how to maximize the days that you have well. You learn how to manage the people and make decisions about that. While the depression is doing what it's doing, your prefrontal cortex is still kind of above the fray, making decisions about how best to maximize your time and your energy. That's interesting.
I get a lot of pastors angry at me because of that. I'll try to move ahead a season of the church year at a time. So in my church body, Lent is a big deal. There's often an extra church service a week. And that's a time of high pressure, and high pressure will often trigger my depression. And so I will try to have all my Lent services ready before the first week of Lent. And I get a lot of pastors really angry at me because I'm done with everything and they're like scrambling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's a good coping strategy to deal with that. It's a well-known phenomenon in addiction as well, that the path to relapse isn't always, oh, I'll just have one, or I want to celebrate. That it often comes at a point at which people are just overwhelmed and frustrated. And so I know what I'm doing is wrong. I know that drinking is bad for me, but I just don't care at this moment.
Yeah. I have that with food. It's
Mm-hmm.
I do not have a great relationship with food, and that's I'll try really hard to cut back on how much I'm eating, and then you know what, forget it.
Mm-hmm.
I said 2 slices of pizza, that was enough. Nope, I'm gonna have a whole lot more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's interesting. There's this ex-Harvard professor. He's retired now, but talks about addiction as being this disorder of that it essentially solves a problem. That when people are overwhelmed, either with rage or with not knowing what to do, that they get a sense of clarity about, well, I'm going to drink. In the same way that someone who's suicidal may actually experience some relief now that they've made a decision to kill themselves, that addiction can happen in the same way. And it's this repeated pattern that you're doing over and over again. And the drugs and alcohol give you a reward for that. And also dopamine is associated with learning. So you kind of overlearn it in this way that becomes kind of automatic. But he suggests,
I didn't know that about the dopamine there. Huh.
Yeah, dopamine is hugely implicated with learning. So in the
Oh,
same way that it's hugely rewarding to do drugs because it releases more dopamine than you can get naturally, it also cements learning in a way that's way beyond what you can get from normal reinforcements. So that's
oh.
why some of the triggers are so powerful, because you've learned them to see. It's like they call it overlearning, the point where it's just almost this automatic impulse. And then it's also associated with drive, and so it causes a drive for drug seeking behavior. Yeah.
Well, I'm learning.
Yeah. Cool. um Now you've chosen to be open and vulnerable about depression. Sounds like that was not an immediate
No, it was not.
decision, and you started slowly. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of being vulnerable and sharing with people that you've got a diagnosis of depression?
Absolutely. So when I was first diagnosed, I went to my pastor. The technical term is a circuit pastor. And I told him I've been diagnosed with this. I don't know what's going to happen. And his immediate reaction was, wow, you're brave for even getting diagnosis.
Wow.
And I did not feel I was brave. I felt this was something that was just necessary. Um, he hooked me up with a counselor. And as I started going through things with trying to find medication and so on, I was getting counseling as well. And that counselor really helped me figure out certain lies that I believed that made the depression far worse. For me, for instance, it was very much approval seeking. If someone didn't like me, I beat myself up and it caused that depression to get worse. And I was in a situation in ministry. Well, pastor, if everyone loves pastor, pastor is probably doing something wrong. Um, there's just, when you're a faithful minister, there's always going to be someone that doesn't like what you're doing, always. And so this,
But they loved Moses, right?
oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah, Jesus also uniformly applauded, and yeah, nothing but walking around with applause and palms before him all the time.
Yeah, yeah. That Palm Sunday was just like, it's the same thing on Good Friday, same exact
Yeah,
thing.
same deal, different day.
So yeah, I had to unlearn that lie, and I'm very thankful that that counseling gave me tools to be able to look and say, okay, what is the lie that I'm believing? Well, while I was going through all that, there was a certain family that I visited every week. There was a mom, a daughter, and a son, and the son was going through membership classes, and the mother and the daughter decided to go through with him. And so I visited them every single week. And one particular week, I was just having a real hard time. It was a down day. And I was not at a point where I was open enough to being able to say, yeah, I shouldn't come in today. So I went to their house, and we all were all sitting around the kitchen table. And I just looked at them and said, I'm sorry. And I don't know what prompted me to say it, because this was not planned. It was just, I have depression and today is a bad day. And the mom looked at me and said, you have depression? Me too. And so did the two kids. And rather than it being this, oh, I feel so bad for you, it was suddenly this joint, there's someone who understands. And we actually ended up growing a lot closer over the years after that, because I knew here was a family that understood, and they knew that I understood. And so we were able to build each other up and encourage each other so much more.
Mm-hmm.
And so what started happening was, family by family, I would start being a little bit more open with it. With those who I was closer to, I was able to go, I'm struggling. Or if someone was having a bad day, I knew, maybe if I share, that's going to encourage them that they're not alone. I never made a formal announcement in my first call, but little by little it got out. I was most scared because there is always someone that wants an excuse to not listen to what God's word says. And when you've got a mental illness, Well, then that could be thrown in your face. Oh, you're just doing this because you've got depression. You've just, or I can't trust you. I remember before I was diagnosed, I did a series in December, a sermon series entitled It's Christmas, So Why Aren't I Happy? And it was very intentional because I looked around at what all the other churches were doing. They're always happy, always happy. And even then I knew, you know what? I'm not always happy at Christmas. Why don't we talk about that? And it was really cool. We advertised it and some people came in that hadn't been in church in years and years because we were talking about this thing. And one of my members pulled me aside and said, Pastor, you shouldn't talk about this. You're supposed to be happy at Christmas. And so there was this butting of heads a little bit that, you're always supposed to be happy, always supposed to be happy. Thanksgiving, I think it was maybe the first Thanksgiving at the church I'm currently serving in Kentucky. The Thanksgiving sermon was, I'm thankful for depression. And talking about how because of depression, I don't lean on me. Because of depression, I know that I am weak, but Jesus is strong enough. It's not about me holding on to him. It's about him holding on to me. One of the things that I really struggled with early on and then finally was able to put to words was, it feels like depression owns me, but that's not the way it is. I have depression. Jesus has me.
Amen.
And because of that, I'm able to rest in him. So it's not easy. Like I said, even just yesterday was one of those days nope, I'm not doing nothing. No motivation. But that forces me then to not lean on me. And that is a positive.
Yeah. I wonder if you could kind of give the most generous and the most generous explanation of what's happening in the mind of the Christian who says, you must be happy, or the Christian who isn't comfortable with being vulnerable and discussing ways in which we're broken. What do you think is going on for that person? If we look at it in kind of the most kind of steel man, that argument, and what do you think's going on?
Every person struggles in different ways. And some people simply don't struggle with feeling down. That's not something that they experience, or at least not in that same way. I think of the movie Inside Out, which is just brilliant. Love that movie. And the main character is Joy. That's who she is. And at the beginning, she might be a little annoying, a little bit over the top, but she's not a bad person. I want everyone to be happy. I want to be happy. I think about Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. And there are some Christians that really internalize that really, really well, to the point that it is just foreign, that it is hard to understand how someone might not. Or they know that that's what you're supposed to do. And just like you would not advertise certain sins because that would be discouraging to someone else or would be a roadblock to someone, well, why would I want to advertise that I'm not being rejoicing? I want people to know that I'm a Christian and that means I'm forgiven. I've got life forever. Why would I ever be sad? And so there's just this not understanding because they don't have that same struggle. They've got a different struggle.
Yeah, thank you. And yet you mentioned in some of your blog entries about Jesus' own strong feelings and his own, I don't know if we would call it a sense of despair, but he was struggling the night before he was crucified. There was something going on with him emotionally and other times as well. What can we learn from how Jesus handles his strong emotions?
One of the first things I go to is that it's not wrong to have that struggle. Bible says very clearly Jesus was without sin. And yet, I love John chapter 11 talks about Jesus and him raising one of his friends, Lazarus, from the dead. And he says, before he goes to see his friend, I'm going to go and bring him back to life. I mean, he's very blunt. He knows what he's going to do. He's got this plan. And yet when he gets to the tomb, it's the shortest verse in the English Bible, Jesus wept. And in the Greek, it's really clear. This is not manly tears, like a single tear dripping down.
Uh-huh.
He's bawling.
Yeah.
If it is okay.
He's like ugly crying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if it's okay for Jesus to do that, it's okay for you. You mentioned the day before Jesus died that he was hurting in the Garden of Gethsemane. In fact, he uses the phrase, he was overwhelmed with sorrow. Overwhelmed. You don't need to be in control of your emotions at all times, or rather, if you're overwhelmed by your emotions, it's not sinful. What you might do when you're overwhelmed, that might be sinful, but just the very fact of being overwhelmed is not sinful. And what's amazing is that Jesus, even through those emotions, served, and he never sinned. And the positive of that for me then too is that he's my substitute and he's your substitute. So that when you sin when you're overwhelmed, when you lose control and you do something that's wrong, when you harm a relationship, when you give in to that addiction, Jesus is your substitute too. He knows that temptation, he has overcome it. And he says to you, I'm going to give you my record. You're forgiven for that too.
Yeah, that is powerful. Yeah. That, I think that's something that ultimately changes hearts, right? And it changes how we react to others, how we react to the compassion we have for ourselves. And it brings glory to God. In resilient recovery, that's something that we do as well. In every meeting that we have, there's a gospel pronouncement, and we first look at our sin, and we use a Bible passage to show this standard which God is asking for, and how in our addiction have we not met that, and that can be sobering. We spend an additional moment or two in silent prayer, confessing anything that we didn't necessarily feel comfortable saying in public. And then there's a gospel message tailored exactly to that sin, reminding people of exactly that Jesus is your substitute. He's not just your role model or your good teacher, that he's actually covered that sin with what he's done. But that brings up an interesting question then. Can you sin? Can depression be a sin? Can you sin as a result of depression? Or is this an illness that God simply has compassion on, the way he does on the leper and the man with the shriveled hand? Or where do you situate depression in this continuum of illness and rebellion or sin? Or how do you see that?
So depression by itself is not a sin. It's a symptom of a broken world. We all have this brokenness in us in some way, and sometimes that shows up physically. The brain of someone with clinical depression it functions differently, and that by itself is not a sin. It's just a symptom. But what you do with that depression could very well end up being sin. I mentioned that I was a cutter for a little bit. That was sin. I was harming the good body that God has given me. That's a sin. The depression wasn't a sin, but the cutting was. I know plenty of people that because of depression have wounded relationships, that have said or ruined relationships with people that were close to them. And that could be a sin, depending on what was the thing that ruined the relationship. What did they do there? And so the struggle by itself doesn't mean you're sinning, but what you're doing could end up being sinful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And kind of a related question to that, then, you talked a bit about counseling helping you identify erroneous thoughts and replace those with more positive ones. What else is helpful to folks that have depression?
For me, I'd mentioned identifying certain lies. And for me now, the three big lies are This is no big deal. I like minimizing it because when you minimize it, then you don't have to deal with it. But the problem is that it's just as big. You're just trying to ignore it. And then it overwhelms you, and it's not a good thing.
It's underestimating an enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, that usually comes in the form of, this is stupid. I should be over this by now. And I hate that. I beat myself up a lot with that even now. That is something that is an ongoing struggle. Another is the lie, I am alone. I'm not alone. And the third lie for me is, this will never end. And it is so easy to look at today and say, this is it. I'm done now. It's never going to get better. And it does. And what I recommend then is, one, getting to know Jesus, and two, getting to know another Christian. And between those two things, there is so much. I love the prophet Elijah. And I'm so happy that God included Elijah in the Bible. I mean, here's a guy who says, let me die. He's begging God to let him die. And what does God do? God feeds him, gives him water, and then gives him time alone in the desert. Says, Elijah, I'm going to take care of your body. I'm going to take care of this so you have time to heal. God thought this was a big enough deal that he gave Elijah time. And then I look at Jesus, who experienced despair, who experienced sorrow at the very least, and wasn't sinning. I see that then he promises, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. I'm not alone. And so as I get to know Jesus, I see someone who says this is a big deal and still loves me and still accepts me and still, for me in particular, gives approval, not of the sin, but of me. He says that I am his child now. And then getting to know other Christians today, not just in history, but to be able to be honest and say, hey, I'm really struggling. And I'm very thankful that with today's technology, there's a number of ways to do that. I've got people I can talk with face to face. If I'm in a place that I cannot handle being with someone else, for me, I can talk online. I've got lots of friends on social media that know me very well and have known me for many years. And so I can call one of them up online just through social media, through chat, and I'm able to say, hey, I'm really struggling, and they are able to help me. And by having a number of choices, then if they're busy, if something's up, there's always someone that I can go to when I'm having one of those struggles. So knowing Jesus and having another Christian that you can drop the mask and just say, hey, I'm struggling, helps so much.
Yeah, I unintentionally kind of had a video that went viral where I was talking about this guru who's had some ways to handle anger. And it was essentially just become willing to experience whatever is out there. He said, become willing until you have no will of your own. I think it's ultimately just such a hollow message that the Christian message acknowledges that you actually do have, your feelings are real. The feelings in and of themselves are not a contamination of your mind, that in fact God it commands us to be angry about certain things. And then this idea that it's not just this thing inside your own head that you work to dispel the sadness or you work to dispel the anger. You work this out in relation to other human beings. It's just so humane, I guess. It acknowledges our humanity and how we're made in a way that just becoming willing until you have no will of your own kind of disengages you from humanity and from the human experience and kind of poo-poos your perhaps very real and valid emotions about something. So yeah, I just think God is so wise in the way that he made us, yes. But he treats us in a way that acknowledges who we really are as humans and doesn't ask us to deny some of our humanity in order to be healed. He wants to redeem that humanity, not just make us become this ethereal ascetic who doesn't experience the lower base emotions and so on. And he actually becomes human himself, Yeah. So much wiser.
I love Psalm 13 is one of my very favorite passages. Psalm 13, it's written by King David. So a guy who faced down David and Goliath, faced down a giant, knew what it was to suffer and knew what it was to be king. And he writes, all day long, I'm wrestling with my thoughts. God, have you forgotten me? And he's just he pours out his heart. And it's a 6-verse psalm. It's very short. First four verses are all this, I'm struggling. And the last 2 verses are, but I'm still going to praise you because I know you love me. And I love that. I don't remember what book I read it in, but one of the books I read said that song gives us permission to talk that way to God.
Mm-hmm.
We can just pour it out and say, you know what? God, I have this ugliness. I have this darkness. I am struggling. And God, I'm even angry at you. I feel like you abandoned me. What's going on here? And in the end, David still says, but I know, even though this is what I'm wrestling with, I know that your love is real.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can fall into this trap of believing that it's self-indulgent to share our feelings with God or to talk so much about what's going on with us internally. But the fact is, God is our Father, and he cares. In the same way that a husband wants to know how his wife's day was, God, he wants to hear how we're feeling and what we're going through. And then also that the fact that psalm ends with that affirmation of trust in God kind of reminds me of how you're managing the up and down of your mood. There's still this part of you that's observing that happen. And that's the part that's locked into God's promises and can help you manage what's going on when you're feeling those things and make decisions from that position of the trust in God rather than what the depression is telling you to do. Yeah. What do you think is you mentioned some of the risks. There's genuine risks of being honest about this stuff. What's the risk of not being open about the things that we're struggling with, and what do churches miss if they're not being open with these things?
I'm going to start right now. This coming Sunday, I'm preaching the 3rd week in a 3-week series on the lies of depression. This is something that we're actually talking about in my congregation right now. And one of the things I looked up, there was a survey done of 200,000 Christians. And of those 200,000 Christians, over 60% said, we want our churches to talk about mental health, which was a shockingly high number to me, that people were saying, I want to talk about this. I want to know what Jesus has to say about this. So I think this is something that a lot of churches miss. And it's actually reading that stat that made me say, yeah, let's talk about this. Let's actually just do a sermon series on this. One of the big risks is something that happened to me, and I think it's the reason that I ended up cutting, is that if you try not to be honest, if you try to bury down and say this is no big deal, what you end up doing is wearing a mask. One of the most common lies is when someone asks how you're doing and you say, I'm fine. One of the most common lies out there. And you wear this mask that says, yep, I'm fine. I'm fine. And what'll happen is that when the pressure builds, the mask starts cracking. And then you've got a choice of either taking down the mask, but that hurts at that point because it's kind of like it's been glued to your face. And so it hurts to take off. And so your choice is either to live with the cracks where people go, what's going on here? Taking off the mask, or putting on another, and then putting on another and putting on another. No, I'm fine. And the pressure just builds and builds and builds until something's got to give. And that's what happened with me, I think, is that I was pretending for so long that when this trigger hit that I could not handle and it went through all those masks, I ended up cutting. It makes it harder to handle. It makes it worse. And it's one of those lies. The lie says that the mask helps you, and it doesn't. It is true that there are certain places where it's wiser to share than with others, absolutely. But the mask hurts. Another movie example, if you see Encanto, I've got a lot of kids, so we do a lot of Disney movies. Um, Encanto is great. It's about a family that says we have to be perfect. We are the ones that everyone else depends on. And so we're going to be perfect. We can't let anyone know that anything is wrong. And there is a song that one of the characters sings, No Pressure, where she says very bluntly, there's so much pressure. I have to keep on going, though, because if I falter, then everyone else falls. And if they were open and honest the entire time, then that pressure wouldn't be there.
Yeah, very true. So on the flip side of that, so those are some of the risks of not being honest. What's the best case scenario if we as Christians become vulnerable and we share the things that are examples of this broken world in us? What's the best case scenario of doing that?
Three things. First, people get the chance to serve you. That sounds very selfish, but if we're all very good and nice people, then we're all very good and nice people, and there's no back and forth on serving one another. I'm very grateful. I've got a member of my congregation that sometimes she struggles with things, and we'll get together and we'll talk. And she always says to me, and you can come to me too. And just that offer, that offer of service is so huge. So when you're vulnerable, you give others the chance to serve you, and you get the chance to serve others, because when you're vulnerable, something really amazing happens that other people say, oh, me too. When I first opened up about my depression, I had family members come to me and say, I've had depression for years. And I looked and went, why didn't you tell me? That'd be great to have, if nothing else, than in a family history. And so I now get the chance to serve more people in a more authentic way. And the third thing, and the most important, is that as a Christian now, Christ shines brighter. Paul talks about himself as a broken jar, and that Christ is this light inside. It's not about me. When I'm broken, I get to point to Jesus and say, look what he has done for me. Look, this is my substitute. It's not about me having my life put together. It's about him loving a broken human like me and forgiving me and accepting me as I am. And when you do that, you give permission to others and you point to Jesus and say, look, he is the one. And then church is not a collection of nice people doing nice things, but a collection of broken people who come to their Savior.
Yeah. My pastor often says Jesus is the hero, not me. And again, in God's wisdom, he knows us and he treats us in this compassionate way. Our shoulders aren't strong enough to bear the weight of the world, and they're not strong enough to fix our own problems. And when we acknowledge that we're broken, it's like a weight comes off. We give that burden to Jesus, and we don't have to carry that weight of trying to pretend that we're our own savior. Yeah.
Yes.
Pastor tells this story about he had crippling anxiety, was hospitalized for it. And he had a lot when he was about to preach, and he would pray every time before he preached, Lord, please don't let me make a fool of myself. And in his process of recovery, he ended up changing that prayer to, well, if I make a fool of myself, may it be to your glory.
Good prayer. Awesome. Yes.
And, I'll point them to you then. And
that is a dangerous prayer. I will say, being more open with my depression, I'm also more open when I make mistakes. I've just started having this particular symptom. I've interviewed a lot of pastors about their depression. That big national survey, 23% of pastors struggle with mental health. Now, 1 in 4 pastors struggle with something with mental health. And that was pre-COVID. I am imagining that number has gone up.
Yeah.
So this is not a small thing. And one of the pastors I interviewed said, when my depression is worse, my memory gets worse. And so he works a lot harder in leading worship then. And in the last few weeks, I've actually forgotten the blessing at the end of worship. In my church, we end almost every service with the same blessing. I've been doing this for over a decade. Come on. But because I'm so open with my depression, then when I mess up, I can just look at the congregation. So, you know what? God knows he's going to bless you. Let's sing the last hymn. And then we just move on.
That happened to our former pastor, Pastor Jeff. And it was a beautiful moment because, this guy's been preaching for like 20 years or something, right? How many times has he said this blessing? And it was like literally like just air for a minute. And then he kind of like smiled because he realized he couldn't remember it. And so somebody from the congregation called out the next line to him. And that got him like one phrase into it. And then he stopped again. And then he called it out again. And it was to me, it was a beautiful moment because just to see our pastor be human and to know something that you've done a million times, you also can just have a moment where your brain slips a gear a little bit and the congregation loves you anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
and the nice thing with that too is that when the leader makes a mistake, it gives permission to others as well. In our congregation, we have screens up that follow the service, and it happens that there's a typo up there or there's the wrong song or something happens. And I always tell the people who do that, because they freak out. This is a graceful place. You make a mistake, you're fine.
Yeah.
Look, I make mistakes all the time. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It releases that pressure too of having, we're not perfect. It's just not gonna happen. So when it happens, we can acknowledge that. I like the fact too that Jesus, he covers our deepest, darkest sins, but he also covers our little embarrassments as well. That he was shamed and he was dishonored on our behalf, and he knows what it feels like, but also he covered it. And so just stupid stuff that I do, or a comment that I make that I shouldn't have made, or whatever that I think about afterwards, that stuff's covered too. It's not just the big, audacious, scary sins, that I'm afraid to say out loud. It's the stupid gaffes and dumb things that I do. Those are covered too. Yeah.
Yes.
Very cool. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to say that we didn't get to. I know you didn't have any really kind of idea what to expect, so I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to communicate that we didn't get to.
Not in particular. This was your show as far as directing the conversation.
Okay. Cool. Well, can we take a minute then and just chat a little bit about what you're going to be talking about at the retreat? Do you have some ideas yet? I know you work ahead. I don't know if you work that far ahead.